Welcome to the BYJU'S Hindu News Analysis for 27th of September 2018. So let's get started. So let's look into the first article. So the first article is about the Aadhaar judgment that was delivered by the Supreme Court yesterday. So what we will be discussing in this particular lecture is about two important aspects. One is the scheme as a whole. So what the Supreme Court said with respect to the scheme, is it constitutional? That is, the Aadhaar as an act, was it constitutional or not? So we will be discussing that aspect, and the second aspect that we will be discussing is with respect to the implementation bit. So what do we mean by it? It means, is Aadhaar breach of privacy? Is Aadhaar including people or excluding people? If it is including people, are these people getting the benefits? If it is excluding people, what are the various loopholes in this particular structure? So all this will be discussed in this particular lecture. There is also an editorial. The editorial is also included in this segment of this judgment by the Supreme Court. So let's try and understand everything with respect to this judgment by the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court, when you look into this particular judgment, has declared that the center's flagship scheme, that is the Aadhaar, is constitutionally valid. That is, this whole scheme or the idea of the Aadhaar is constitutionally valid, but there are certain other things. Let's say, for example, something to do with the bank accounts, or to do with the education, or how the private companies are using the Aadhaar data, or with respect to the mobile phone companies. All these things are scrapped down, but instead the scheme as a whole, that is the Aadhaar as a whole, is said that it is constitutionally valid. So let's try and understand some of the important points with respect to the inclusions as well as the exclusions that the Supreme Court has said with respect to this particular judgment. So when you look into what are the various exclusions that the Supreme Court has said, the first point it raises is with respect to the educational domain. So what has it said? So the Supreme Court has advised all the educational institutes, that is the NEET, the JEE, the UGC, the CBEC, that you would not be able to take up the data anymore from now on. So what it has said is that in case any school or any institution or a management institute is asking for the Aadhaar details, then any individual or a person cannot be giving it, or he will not entitled to give it. This is what the Supreme Court has said in this particular set. What the court has said in this particular case with respect to the children is that children need not have to provide this particular Aadhaar details. So we all know from the fact that Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, which provides education to all the children between the age group of 6 to 14 years, is a fundamental right, and because it is a fundamental right given under the Constitution, mandatory Aadhaar is not required in this particular case. So what is the crux here? It says two important things: that institutions will not be able to force the students to provide the Aadhaar details, and at the same time it has exempted children, especially from 6 to 14 years, to not provide any Aadhaar details, as education under fundamental right is to be guaranteed. So this is what we need to understand with respect to the education. On the other hand, what we also need to look at is from the private companies perspective. So what does it say? So the Supreme Court has quashed section 57 as unconstitutional. That is, there was a particular section, that is section 57 of the Aadhaar, which was basically given that targeted delivery of financial and other subsidy benefits and acts 2016, which permitted that certain private entities like the telecom companies or other corporates to avail the biometric Aadhaar data. So what the Supreme Court has said in this particular case is that all you private companies which were insisting for the Aadhaar data to provide services to the customers, to provide services to the individuals, you don't have to collect the Aadhaar details, and it has completely struck down section 57, which is to do with the private companies. And then something it goes on to speak with the mobile phone or connections. There was a call by all the mobile phone connection or the internet service providers that Aadhaar needs to be seeded, and we will have to give our Aadhaar details, and if not given, then the SIM card would be freezed and it will be deactivated. So this was the call that was given by all the mobile connections. So what we will have to understand in this particular case is the SIM card, in case we are buying it, we don't have to give the details or the Aadhaar number in the future. However, what the government would be able to initiate is, it would be able to come up with a law that mandates the Aadhaar for obtaining a SIM card. But what the Supreme Court has said is that in the future, any individual or a person need not have to provide the Aadhaar details in order to get access to the SIM card or in order to get the internet for his personal services. And then it goes on to further speak about the bank account, where it has further said that all the banks and the other financial institutions cannot again seek for the Aadhaar data. This basically means that any bank, let's say for example the SBI or the HDFC or any financial institutions, or for example the payment banks like the Paytm, the PhonePe and so on, cannot actually threaten an individual or a person that if he is not able to provide this Aadhaar details, we will quash off your account. So they will not be able to say all this, and that is what the Supreme Court has said in this particular case, that in case you are not able to provide the Aadhaar details, still the bank account will be sustained and it will not be freezed, and you will be able to conduct the operations, is what the exclusion criteria has spoken with respect to this judgment. However, what we also need to understand is that the Aadhaar has also been made mandatory. Certain inclusions have been made. What it has also said is, with respect to this judgment, that there are certain things where Aadhaar is mandatory. So let's try and understand what are those areas where the Supreme Court has said that Aadhaar is important. So one of the key important parameters that it is spoken is with respect to the government schemes, which involves the subsidies and the benefits. So what happens in this particular case is, let's say for example the government is coming up with a number of schemes, and all these schemes that the government is coming up with, let's say for example the LPG subsidy, or for example the Manrega. So all this is been bought up by the government in order to provide benefits and subsidies to the lower rung people. So what is happening in this particular case is, in case any person wants to avail these type of subsidies or the ration or the LPG subsidies or the Manrega schemes, what he has to do is he has to furnish his Aadhaar number. Why? Because the Supreme Court obviously feels that this particular act of the government was basically done to eliminate the ghost accounts. So what do we mean by it? Let's say for example, in the number of years that we have seen in the governance aspect, what has happened with time is that there are people who are actually not able to claim the subsidies, they're not able to claim the benefits, they're not able to get the aspects of the fruitful scheme delivery. Why? Because of the presence of ghost accounts. So what these ghost accounts basically do is, all those people who are supposed to get these schemes benefits are not getting it, but instead those people who are already well off are the ones who are actually getting it. This is what Amartya Singh calls as Matthew effect. So what do we mean by Matthew effect? So Matthew effect is that particular entity of economics where the ones, the middle class and the higher middle class, get the majority of the scheme benefits, but the lower poor and the BPL car holders are not getting it. So the government has basically come up with this particular scheme in order to eliminate this particular idea of ghost effect and that entity of Matthew effect, so that all these people who are not able to sustain their life will be able to extract maximum mileage with respect to this particular entity. So what Justice Sikri has said is that we will have to make use of the technology, and technology is a very important tool for ensuring good governance in a social welfare state. So in order to make sure that the government is able to provide benefits to these lower rung people, and in order to eliminate these people, that is the ghost accounting people, and then what we have to provide is that this marginalized sections of the society need to be provided the dignified life. So in order to provide them all the dignified life, what we need is this authentication process, and that is what the Aadhaar is being doing. So in order to find this solution, what this Supreme Court has said is that we will be sustaining this Aadhaar links necessity for the subsidies as well as the benefits, and until and unless we have an alternative provisions that need to be provided in case of authentication failures, we will be continuing with this particular Aadhaar process. And further it has gone on to speak about the PAN card. So what it has said is that Aadhaar is necessary to be linked with the PAN card because India is a country where there are a lot number of people who are absconding and not paying the taxes, and what we need is a higher GDP to tax ratio. So in order to make sure that this is actually met, what the Supreme Court has actually said is that we will have to make sure that Aadhaar numbers are actually seeded and enrolled with the income tax returns, so that there is much increase in the GDP to tax ratio. So in line with the Supreme Court judgment, what the government, that is the finance minister represented by Arun Jaitley, has said is that this particular act of this Aadhaar is actually helped the government in terms of the good governance, that it is able to save around 90,000 crores in the past 3 years. So because it is able to save 90,000 crores in the past 3 years, what the central government under finance ministry says is that this act by the Supreme Court of sustaining this Aadhaar for this particular subsidy is a very good move. So moving on, what we will have to understand is with respect to the money bill, that is the structural aspect. So what the Supreme Court has actually said is that Aadhaar as a scheme is constitutionally valid. So when Aadhaar as a scheme is constitutionally valid, one of the crux areas that comes behind the background is that this particular act was passed as a money bill. So is this particular act is constitutionally viable or not? And when we look into the constitutional viability, the majority judgment, what the majority judgment has said in this particular case is that for any particular scheme, whether the subsidies or the benefits, or for example we are providing certain important arms and relief provisions, or the facility or the utility or certain other assistance to the poor young people, and for all this you need the money, and this money is drawn from the Consolidated Fund of India. And when you are drawing money from the Consolidated Fund of India, it obviously means that we are taking money from the taxation bit, and that is why it is viable, and that is why it can be called as the money bill. So what the majority judgment said is that whatever the government has passed with respect to money bill, it is constitutional. Why? Because for all these schemes that we will need is the money, and we are drawing money from the Consolidated Fund, and that is why it is important for us to say that this is a money bill. However, what the dissenting judgment, that is by Chandrachud, has actually gone about saying is that this cannot be ruled as a money bill. Why? It is simply because there is one particular act, and this particular act not only involves the parameters of the money bill, but it also includes other part, and when it includes other part, what we are supposed to do is we will have to push it through the Rajya Sabha, where Rajya Sabha also has equal powers, and by bifurcating or moving away from this particular act, what we are doing is we are violating certain structural constitutional matter, and this amounts to the fraud on the constitution, and this can be liable to be struck down, is what the Justice Chandrachud has actually spoken about. So what he says is that this particular bill, which was passed as a money bill, is not in line with the constitutional principles, and it needs to be struck down. However, this was not taken into picture. Why? Because it was a majority judgment, which is 4:1, and that is why this is accepted as the money bill according to the Supreme Court judgment. Another important point that we will have to understand is with respect to the people who are excluded. So what it says is that there are number of people, let's say for example the disabled or several others who include the elderly, the young. So there are number of people who are not actually included in this particular Aadhaar enrollment. So what the Supreme Court has actually said in this particular case is that it has already enrolled a large number of people, but there are certain number of people who are all enrolled. So what you will have to do in this particular case is make sure that you are able to plug the loopholes within the particular system, and you are able to devise a strategy so that all people come under the ambit of this particular scheme, and they are able to derive the benefits of this particular scheme. And what it also says is that in order to make sure all this is happening, what it has suggested the government as well as the UIDAI is to bring in regulations to prevent rightfully entitled people from being denied the benefits. So what does the Supreme Court speak about the privacy? So when we look into what the Supreme Court speaks about the privacy, the Aadhaar Act does not violate any individual's right to privacy. So what the Supreme Court has said is that this particular organization, UIDAI, has made sure that all the parameters when it comes to the security are fully covered, and data collection by Aadhaar is actually quite minimal, and it is basically done in order to serve the larger public interest. Now that because the UIDAI has completely made sure that all the loopholes are addressed, this is not becoming a surveillance state, and this is not running running a mapping program or it is not scanning an individual. So it is not a breach of the privacy. And so what we are saying is, in case you feel that there is a dearth with respect to the implementation with respect to the data security, what we would suggest to the government is come up with certain stringent rules with respect to data protection so that there is no breach of privacy. However, what it says is that the individual's right to privacy is sustained, and the Aadhaar has made sure that all the loopholes are addressed in this particular scheme. And one of the other important things that we will have to understand is that it has struck down some of the important parameters when it comes to certain sections of the Aadhaar. So the first point that we have to understand is what is the difference between struck down and what is the difference between the read down. So what do we mean by struck down? In this particular aspect, what we will have to understand is the whole law or the whole idea of this particular section will be completely eliminated. But when you say read down, there will be certain sections or certain ambiguous sections which will be eliminated. The law or a section as a whole will not be eliminated. So the basic difference between struck down and read down is that fundamental aspect, where in struck down the whole law or a particular section will be completely eliminated, but with respect to read down it will be only certain compartments within that particular section which will be read down. So what the Supreme Court has said with respect to this particular idea of struck down and read down is, let's look into the first section, that is 33 of 1. So earlier what used to happen is, in case a judge from the district judge or above, in case he feels that certain data has to be extracted of an individual, then permission from the district judge would be enough. But what has happened in this particular case? So what has happened in this particular case is, it bestows the right on that individual, and the permission of that individual needs to be taken even if it is ordered by the district judge. So the earlier judge did not require the person's permission, but this judgment says that the permission of the person would be required, that he needs to be heard in case any of his identity or the authentication records have to be extracted. So this is with respect to the section 31. And then it also speaks with respect to section 32, where it says identity and authentication data has to be disclosed if it is in the interest of the national security. So what does this section say? So when you look into the earlier act, what it says is that there is a joint secretary, and this joint secretary or any person who is above him would be able to give this particular protection and would be able to give this permission to the person to extract information of a person in case there is a national security threat. But what did the judgment say? So the judgment in this particular case has said that it is not only the joint secretary, but this will also require the consent of the judge of the High Court. So both these people, that is the joint secretary as well as the judge of the High Court, will have to decide in case any information has to be revealed in this particular case of national security. And apart from this, it has also struck down section 47. So section 47 says court shall not take cognizance of offence under the act except on a complaint filed by the UIDAI. So in case there is any criminal complaints that has to be registered, earlier model said that only UIDAI would be able to file a charge sheet or it would be able to complain. But in this particular case, any individual, in case he feels that there is a breach or any criminal complaint that has to be lodged, then he would be able to do it, is what the Supreme Court has said. So what are the various challenges that we see according to this particular argument? So when we look into what exactly the Supreme Court has said, the Supreme Court has left a number of void areas. So what are the void areas that it has left about? Let's say, for example, all the private companies. So the private companies has actually collected all our data. So the SIM companies or the mobile companies or the internet service providers have already collected our data. But what about the data which is already collected? This it has not voiced its opinion upon. So these are some of the challenges that is there with respect to this particular act of Aadhaar. So moving on, let's look into the next article. So the next article says boost to SC/ST quota in promotion. So in the year 2006, the government came up with one of the proposals whether the promotion should be awarded to certain individuals within the SC/ST community, and this goes up to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court in this particular judgment of the Nagraj case way back in the 2006 said that states were bound to provide quantifiable data on the backwardness of the SCST before providing them quota in the promotions. So this particular case that was filed by the government in the Supreme Court had three important parameters. So what are the three important parameters? One is with respect to the backwardness, and the second is with respect to the inadequacy, and the third question that it speak about was the efficiency. So what the Supreme Court has delivered judgment in this particular case is with respect to the backwardness all alone, but it has not touched upon these aspects, that is to do with the inadequacy as well as the efficiency. So let's try and understand what the Supreme Court has spoken about with respect to the backwardness. So what the Supreme Court has said with respect to the backwardness is that you, the state government or the central government, in case you have to provide reservation with respect to the promotion for the SC/ST community, you don't have to provide the data with respect to the backwardness. That is, you don't have to say that a particular person is backward, you don't have to say that a particular person belonging to this particular community which is there in the SC/ST is backward. So you don't have to provide quantifiable statistics with respect to this backwardness. So it has not looked into the inadequacy aspect, it has not looked into the inefficiency aspect, but it has focused its parameters only on the backwardness, and it has delivered the judgment. So what did the current judgment say? So the current judgment, when it was looking into these all the parameters, what it has said is that this idea of providing the reservation to the SC/ST community goes against the Indira Savni case. So what has it said? So this particular judgment, what it quotes is the test or requirement of social and educational backwardness cannot be applied to the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribe who indubitably fall within the expression of backward class of citizens. So in the Indira Savni case, what was proved was the minute they are there in that particular SC/ST community, they have already suffered a lot of losses, they have been penalized in ages, called untouchable for ages, and they have faced social discrimination. So in this particular case, what the Indira Savni cases says is that we don't have to look at the social as well as the educational backward. So what Nariman actually, who pronounced this particular judgment, says is that in case there is an individual who is placed in the presidential list for the scheduled tribes, or he is placed in the presidential list of the scheduled tribes, then such people don't have to prove their backwardness. So the minute you have your names enlisted in that particular SC/ST list that is provided by the presidential order, then you don't have to provide any other statistics with respect to the backwardness. Why? Because these people with time have suffered a lot of pain, and they were always treated as untouchables, and because they were treated as untouchables, that is why these people needs to be protected. And for this, what we need is, we do not require any backwardness clauses, we do not require any quantifiable data, but instead what we need is, we need to promote them. And why are we doing all this? So that all these backward classes of the citizens move forward, and they are able to march ahead hand in hand with the citizens of the other people on an equal basis. This is what the Supreme Court has clearly said in this particular judgment. So moving on, let's look into the next article. So the next article says center hikes import duty on select goods. So let's try and understand everything with respect to this particular article. So what is the context? So when we look into the context, what it says is the government on Wednesday released a list of 19 categories of items on which it would be hiking the import duties, which include the white goods. So what are the white goods here? It is the air conditioners, the refrigerators and the washing machines, as well as non-essential items, which include something like the gems, the travel bags, the aviation turbine fuel. So what are the 20 parameters? Just have a fair bit of an idea on all these things. So you have the air conditions, where it is increased from 10% to the 20%, household refrigerators, which is increased from 10 to 20%, and then speakers, which is increased from 10 to 15%. So there are number of other things, just have a fair bit of an idea. But what is the major objective? Why did the government come up with this particular idea? So the major aim or the objective of this particular hiking or increasing the custom duties is because there has been increase in the current account deficit. So because there has been increase in the current account deficit, in order to reduce this particular aspect of current account deficit, the government has come up with this particular move. So what happens in this particular case is, let's say for example there are more imports. So when we are there are more imports into the country, what happens is we are shelling a lot of money. So So there is moving of dollar from India to another country. So in order to reduce the drain of the currency reserves and in order to give boost to the domestic economy, that is why the government has come up with this particular move. So when we look into the statistics, the total value of imports of these items in the year 2017-18 was about 86,000 crores. So this can be completely saved in case the imports are actually reduced, right? That is why the government has actually come up with this particular move. So this hike is duty may not impact the importers where India has already signed the free trade agreements. So in case India has already signed a free trade agreement with those countries, India would be able to still import, but this particular idea of custom duties is imposed on those countries where India is not signed the free trade agreement. But if India has already signed the free trade agreement with those countries, we will not have any issues. But if India has not signed the free trade agreement, that is when we will have issues, is what this article all about. So moving on, so the next article says Chardham project NGT forms panel. So the first important point we need to understand is what is this Chardham highway project. So this Chardham Mahamang Vikas Puryojana, or it is called as the Chardham project, is one of the most important initiatives in order to improve the connectivity in the Chardham area, that is in the Himalayas. So what are these Chardham areas? It involves the Gangotri, the Yamunotri, the Kedarnath as well as the Badrinath. So the project's main objective is to develop around 900 kilometers of national highways to make the travel safer as well as more convenient, and this project will be falling along National Highway 134, that is old National Highway 94 in the state of Uttarakhand. So the two important points from the prelims perspective is what is Chardham and which are the regions involved in it, and then which is the state that it is hosted in. So these two important points can be asked in the prelims. So we will have to know both these important parameters, and apart from this, the project will be built under the engineering, procurement and construction mode. So this is important from the prelims perspective. So what was the need of this particular project is the next question that pops up. So what we see is in the year 2013, Uttarakhand had a devastating flood, and this flood resulted in lot of damage to the roads. So in order to make sure that this damage is actually controlled and the future travel becomes completely safer and convenient, that is why this project was also initiated. And apart from this, there are a number of roads that are leading to the Gangotri and Badrinath, which are strategically important in terms of the border areas. So this particular area borders along the China. So because it is bordering along the China, it becomes very strategic and very important, and this helps in proper supply and deployment of forces in case of any security threat. So the main reasons as to why this particular project was initiated is one, because the project had a devastating flood, that is 2013 we had a lot of damage to the roads, and in order to create a strategic advancement, in order to make sure that there are supply and deployment of defense established along the Indo border areas in Uttarakhand, that is why this particular move was actually taken up. What are the components? So when we look into the components, what it clearly goes on to say is the key important parameters is all these roads that were there earlier were completely narrow. So what this particular project basically goes on to do is it widens this particular construction area. So earlier what we had was a terrain which was completely narrow, and what we are currently doing is this, we are widening the particular terrain so we would be able to prevent the damage. And the second important point is all these areas that are currently there are filled with landslides areas, and in order to prevent and protect the landslide hazard zones, what we need is number of other things. Let's say for example what we will be constructing is certain bridges in order to prevent this, and what we will also have is certain bypasses so that we are not passing through this particular area. And the most important point is we will have certain elevated corridors. So this Chardham project has certain components and it includes all these important parameters. So what is the significance? So when we look into the significant aspect, what we will realize is this will increase the tourism. So because there is boost in the infrastructure, what this can also result is in the employment opportunities. So there is boost in the employment, there is boost in the tourism sector, and what we will also see is that this will also reduce the time it takes for the travel. So all these is the important significant aspect. But what is the most important point that we are discussing here is that NGT actually forms a panel to see if this will have any adverse effects or the environmental effects on this particular project. So in case there is anything, this particular panel will look into it and it will give its recommendations, and we will be discussing about it in the future. But as of now, this is all we will have to understand. So moving on, let's look into the next article. So the next article says recyclers storing electronic waste hazardously, Environment Ministry. So what is the context? So when we look into the context, there was one of the reports that was released by the Environment Ministry, and this Environment Ministry report says that this electronic waste that is there in India is actually not recycled properly. Either it is recycled at a very abysmal level, or what is done is, even if it is recycled, it is recycled in the hazardous conditions. So what it goes on to say is that India almost generates about 2 million tons of e-waste annually, and for this what we need is a particular plan. And in order to overcome all the hazards that are there with respect to the e-waste management, the central came up with one of the important rules, and that was in the year 2017, and that is the e-waste rules. And this, when you consider the institutional mechanism, who actually contributes to this, who actually implements this, and who actually looks into and monitors this particular program, it is the Central Pollution Control Board as well as the State Pollution Control Board. It is these organization or the institution which will look into the implementation as well as the monitoring of the e-waste management rules. So what we will have to understand in this particular case is that what had the central government, when it notified the 2017 e-waste management rule, says is that in case there is any organization or any manufacturing company, it has to manufacture its products and it has a particular end life of this particular product. So what it had suggested was that this organization which manufactures this equipment, after it has done with this end of its life, they'll have to take this back to their organization, and what it has to do is it has to recycle this particular e-waste, is what the e-waste management rules of the 2017 had said. However, what we actually go about realizing is that this particular implementational model is not intact. So when we say in 2017-18 companies were supposed to have collected 70%, and in the year they should have been collected to 70%, that is in the year 2023. But what has happened in this particular case is that there are number of transgressions which are committed according to the report. Why? Because any company which is actually collecting back its e-waste has to give it to the formal organizations, but the problem is the number of formal organizations are comparatively less. There is only 178 registered e-waste recyclers, but the number of non-formal e-cyclers are comparatively more. And what we will have to understand is all the mechanisms that these organizations, that is the e-waste recyclers, are using is non-environmental friendly. That is, it is not environmental friendly. They don't have a storage mechanism. They don't know how to handle this particular waste and the processing of e-waste. So they're non-environmental friendly. That is, they're not following the rules that are sustainable. That's the first key entity. And the second thing is the non-compliance with the guidelines of the Central Pollution Control Board. So there has been a layout that has been laid by the CPCB as well as the SPCB. This particular structure has to be followed, but what has happened in this particular case is they're not following this particular structure. And the third important point that we will have to understand is all these recycling facilities are certain areas or non-operational, and even if it is operational in certain areas, the devices that is supposed to be used are not used. That is because all these devices are comparatively expensive. The capacity to actually recycle this e-waste is not completed at a higher level. This is what this particular report goes on to speak. So what this particular report goes on to say is that the laws that were supposed to be in place, that the rules that were supposed to be followed, that was supposed to be implemented, are not successfully enforced. There are laws, but the implementation is very bad, is what this article goes about speaking. So let's try and understand the next article. So the next article says Yamin trying to hold on to power, says opposition, for which we will have to understand the background. So let's try and understand the background and then come back to this particular article. So when we look into the the background, what it says is that Maldives opposition leader Ibrahim Modi Suli scored victory over the incumbent president, that is Abdul Yamin, in the country's presidential polls. So according to the Maldives Foreign Ministry, the Maldivian Democratic Party candidate Soli won with 1,34,616 votes against the Yamin's 96,132 votes. So what has happened in this particular case? The Maldivian ex-president Abdullah Yamin actually lost the elections, and now we have a new person which is headed by the Maldivian Democratic Party, that is Mohammed Salih, who has actually scored the victory. So Soli was also backed by former presidents, that is Mohammed Nasheed as well as Abdul Mohammed Gayoom. So let's try and understand everything with respect to this elections. So one of the important aspects that we will have to understand is why this elections in Maldives was a tough one for the opposition as well as for the democracy. So let's try and understand some of the important points with respect to the same. So the first point says former President Mohammed Nasheed was disqualified from contesting the elections. Why was he disqualified from contesting elections? Because he was actually convicted according to some terrorism laws. So when we look into the laws that was framed in order to make sure that this particular person was not contesting the elections, he was framed under certain terrorism laws. So because he was framed under certain terrorism laws and because he was convicted according to this terrorism laws, he was not able to contest the elections. And then you have the former president Mohammed Abdul Gayoom, who was also behind bars. And why was he behind bars? Because he is said that he was planning to attempt a coup to actually dislodge the present president. So he was also behind bars, and the headquarters of the main opposition party, that is the Maldivian Democratic Party, to which Mr. Soleh belongs, was also raided. So there was days where the number of security personnel or the election commission and the coach were all not under the control of the institutional mechanisms. So this was completely controlled by the president. And what was also happening was the opposition, where they actually function, their buildings were also raided. And what was happening is the counting procedures were changed at the last minutes, which led to a lot of confusion. So you already have a restricted or a laid out structure, but what happened in this particular cases, there was a final minute changeover with respect to the how the polling will be conducted. So this will infuse a lot of confusion and dilemma in the opposition minds, right? And apart from this, many foreign journalists were also denied visa, and this also included certain Indian people, Indian journalists who wanted to go up to Maldives and see how exactly was the functioning of the elections, but all this was denied. So because of all these things, because of all these struggles that Maldives went through, that is why this becomes a very important elections. Why? Because Yamin wanted to capture the elections and he wanted to win elections, and that is why he did not let the opposition function properly, and at the same time he also had the support of the institutional mechanisms. And what we have to understand is in reference to India. So when we look into the most important parameters is India and Maldives had certain tensions, we had certain stress in our relationship. And why was this? Let's try and understand. It says India had criticized the Yamin government for the imposition of the emergency. So the Maldives government came up with the emergency, and when it had the emergency, there was concern over the functioning of the democratic institutions. So which we did discuss, the parliament, the judiciary, the number of institutions which were supposed to be under control, which were supposed to be functioning independently, were not functioning independently. Why? Because it was under the administrative control of the President Yamin. And also what we also need to understand is there were certain clamping down on visas to the Indian job holders. So the Indian job holders who got the working provision, who wanted to go to Maldives to work, were also denied the visa. This has resulted in a lot of stress and strain in the relationship. And also what we also need to understand is a Chinese investment in the Maldives. On one side you have the direct conflict between India as well as Maldives. On the other side, what we also see is increase in the Chinese investment in the Maldives. So what Mr. Yamin had done was he had embraced China, that is he had gone to China and he almost signed about 12 key agreements with China, and he also signed a free trade agreement with China. And this free trade agreement, what it says is, after Pakistan, China entered with Maldives with this particular relationship. So what he started doing was he started getting close and close with China, and China started investing a lot of money into the Maldives, and what it led to was the infrastructural growth in Maldives. And this infrastructural growth was indirectly acting on the string of pearls theory. So what did China do? China started investing a lot of money. One is in the form of airport development, the other one is in the form of bridge development. So what China did was it started investing a lot of money in the infrastructural development, and this was how Yamin was able to irritate India, and also this was also a major tussle with respect to India and Maldives relations. Also, what we need to understand from this particular perspective is that China has its own way of doing business with respect to any country. So when you look into the West, that is the USA, or let's say for example the European powers, what they basically did when they were in the imperialistic or the neo-colonialistic model was they basically believed in replacement of one entity or one institution or one democratic entity with another. So what they basically went on to do was that USA or any other Western European countries, only those people who were favorable to them or those political parties who were favorable to them were replaced and held up in that particular area, and they had a diplomatic relationship. But what is different when it comes to the Chinese way of investment is China does not want any of the persons, or it does not meddle much with the internal politics. So what China does in this particular area is China basically goes about doing business rather than entering into the political aspect. So whichever political party it is, whichever political person it is, or whoever the individual is, China would be able to do its investment. It will be able to make infrastructural growth, or it has also plans of increasing the diplomatic levels. But this was not the case with the Western European countries. So the Western European countries basically believed in the idea of replacement, but the Chinese investment model was about not going with the internal politics, but it is about including a lot of diplomatic engagement irrespective of who the political organization is, irrespective of who the individual is. That's the key difference between the Western as well as the Chinese model. So what happened after this? So India actually came up with the reaction. So the Ministry of External Affairs said elections mark not only the triumph of democratic forces in the Maldives, but also reflects the firm commitment to the values of democracy and the rule of law. And Prime Minister Narendra Modi also called Mr. Soli, underscoring his support for better ties with respect to the two countries. So we were in a particular relationship. India had a very good relationship, but what happened was there was a lot of and skirmishes. So but now India is very happy that there is democracy that has taken place and the opposition has come into it. Why? Because there was a constant tussle between India and Maldives due to emergency as well as the meddling of the democratic institutions as well as supporting the Chinese investments in Maldives, while Maldives is within the reach of India. So India did not have a very good relationship, but now India is happy that an opposition has come into picture. But there are certain challenges ahead that we will have to understand. What are the major challenges? So the unity will be tested in the governance. So all the political parties, the different political parties have come up together. So you have Mr. Nasheed, you have Mr. Abdul Gayoom, and then you have Mr. Soli, all coming up together in order to fight President Abdul Yamin. So what will be tested in the future, whether this particular coalition of all these partners will be there or not, is what will be tested. And the next important point is fragile democracy can also be susceptible to radical ideologies if not effectively governed. So what can also happen is we know that there are certain elements of radical Islam. So if it is not governed, then there can be theological impediment to this particular organization. And apart from this, China's economic presence in the Maldives is also a reality. So we did discuss about the how Chinese diplomacy can be taken differently from the US as well as the European countries. So what can also be understood from this aspect is that China is not going to take it easy, and it is going to pump in a lot of money to make sure that this particular new political party that is in picture will be able to come and fall under its lap. So those are the challenges that we will have to wait and watch in the future. So what is that India has to do? So when we look into what India has to do, India has to reset its ties with will the Maldives. India has to stand together with the aspirations of the people. It is not about the political parties that India has to look into, but it has to make sure that the aspirations of the citizens are met by India. It is not the political parties. So in case India is able to be free with those people, India is able to do good things for the people, then it would be able to have good understanding with the people. And New Delhi should also stay cleared of the partition positioning and instead should be banking on whatever comes its way. And the most important thing is that it has to partner with the Maldives in its stability as well as the developmental program. So this is what we need to understand with respect to the elections. However, what this particular article goes about speaking is that the Maldivian president has actually applied to the Supreme Court, and he says that this particular act of democracy or the elections should be completely annulled, as the presidential election states that there is a lot of misconduct and corruption in this particular elections. So what he had said earlier was that he is proper, that this particular elections was proper, and I'm ready to step down because the people of this particular country have asked me to step down, and that is what the Maldivian president, ex-Maldivian president, had said. But now what he is saying is that there is a lot of misconduct, there is lot of corruption, and because there is all this, what we will be doing is that we want this particular elections to be annulled and we want new elections, is what President Yamin has said. So we will keep a close watch with respect to whatever is happening, but as of now this is what we need to understand with respect to this article. So moving on, let's look into the next article. So the next article is with respect to the G4 for UN Security Council reform multilateralism. So the first important point from the prelims perspective that we need to understand is who are the G4 countries. So the G4 countries in this particular case is, one, you have the Brazil, and then you have India, that is represented by Sushma Swaraj, and then you have Germany as well as Japanese. So this can be represented by big G. So this is how you need to remember. Big stands for Brazil, India, Germany as well as Japan. So what they actually go about saying is that these four countries, that is Brazil, India, Germany as well as Japan, want is that there has been a lot of changes. So we have 5 permanent members in the form of USA, France, Russia, China and UK. So with time what has happened is there has been a lot of changes which is not reflecting the global realities. There have been a number of complex challenges with respect to the climate change, with respect to the terrorism. So there are number of important aspects. And when did the security personnel become permanent? It was way back in the 1950s and the 1940s. So because there has been a lot of complexities with time, because there have been a number of geopolitical changes, it is not meeting the global realities. So what these G4 countries have said is that we, that is the G4 countries, are coming together. We are supporting each others as a candidature for the permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council. So what it has said is that we are a legitimate candidate for the permanent membership in the expanded as well as the reformed Security Council. Why? This particular idea was only proposed in the 40s and the 50s, and there has been a lot of transformations, lot of changes and lot of complexities, and these complexities will have to be addressed, which involves the terrorism, which involves the climate change. And in order to give heed and address all these issues, we have come up together. So what it says is that we will have to accelerate the outreach towards achieving all these important parameters, and we need certain meaningful reform for the Security Council. And what we will have to understand is certain important factual data, that is Germany and Japan contribute 1/5 of the UN budget, while the 4 countries together have 1/5 of the world population. So what we will have to understand as a whole is that these 4 countries are coming together in order to claim a permanent membership in the United Nations Security Council. So this is all we will have to understand with respect to this article. So kindly look into the BYJU'S CNA, look into the practice questions both pre as well as mains, write all your answers on the comment section so that we can evaluate and give you the relevant feedback for the same. So this is it for today. Thank you so much. All the best.